Hello, this is Nathan from nathanmooth.com coming at you with a short tutorial about how to use the Rain 2.0 asset, which I have created and which you can download from the Orbolt store. So this is a project I've been working on to fill a need in my workflow. I love Houdini. I love how adjustable it is, how you can change everything right down to the ground level. However, it's nice sometimes to have a tool that you can just throw in and get a look right off the bat. So, for example, environmental effects, something that I find myself wanting this for quite often. And so I created a tool where I can place this in a scene and get a decent looking rain effect right away. And then as the scene progresses, I have the controls available to me to easily tweak the effect and get the perfect look for the final render. So with that being said, let's dive into the scene. So as you can see, the scene's basically empty. We have a camera and an area light here for rendering purposes. I also have a Manta node already set up, so we get some nice renders right off the bat. And let's drop in our rain node. There we go. And wait for it to load in. Okay, so we have our rain node here. And inside this little gear icon, for ease of use and quick setup, I have included in the asset 3 basic presets that you can start with: light rain, heavy rain, and drizzle. And the nice thing about presets in Houdini is you can create your own and save them to this menu. So in the future, if you have a look that you like, save it here, and then every time you load up your node, you can just hit that and boom, you have your nice looking rain right away. I'm going to start off with the heavy rain preset, and that's gone through, set up our controls to let us have some nice looking heavy rain right out of the box. Now, as you can see, if I hit the play button down here, no rain showing up, and that's because this node requires some input geometry to act as emitters and colliders. So for an emitter today, let's just do a simple grid. Throw that down, rename it emitter, and let's lift it up into the air a bit. Right about there should do. Go back in our camera view just for convenience sake. And I'm also going to include a ground, which will also be a grid. So rename that ground. And there we go. So let's drop our emitter into the emitter slot here. You can see with this plus button here, we can add multiple emitters if we want, as well as multiple colliders or multiple grounds. Now, a ground is different from a collider in the sense that grounds tend to be two-dimensional and easy to extrude in the y-axis. However, colliders tend to be three-dimensional or predefined collision volumes. So let's drop our ground into the ground slot here. So now we have an emitter and a ground, and let's add a collider. I'll just use a sphere, and that'll just add some variety to the scene. Drop that into the colliders tab. There we go. And if I head up here and hit the reset simulation button, that will process all the nodes we've added, and up here at the top we can actually see the rain already beginning to form. So if I hit the play forward button, we can see that we're getting some nice heavy looking rain right off the bat. And that's just with defining our emitter and our collider objects right there. Now also something that you can't see very well, unfortunately, is we have splashes going on down here wherever the rain is hitting the ground or the other collider objects in the scene. I'm going to exaggerate that just so we can see it more easily in the viewport. So I'm going to go in here. As you can see, I went into the rain geo tab. Down in the splash subsection, there's the raindrop size splash, and you can see it's actually connected to this other raindrop size. These are defining, this raindrop size is defining the actual normal size of these raindrops, although you can set the size variance here so it changes a little, you get some random variety. Down here in the splash, I'm using that size again to calculate how big the splash should be in relation to the physical properties of the raindrop. Sometimes that's not what you want. Sometimes you want something a bit more exaggerated. So for example, I'm going to pop this up to, let's go all the way up to 0.1. And boom, right off the bat you can see we have the splashes going on there, and they're much more visible now. Let me highlight that again, it's easy to see when it's yellow. Let's play it forward one more time, see what that looks like. And there we go, we're getting splashes on the ground, splashes on the sphere object here. And you can also see the wind is affecting our rain and blowing it sideways, and blowing these splashes a little as well. It creates a very cool looking effect, I think. Alright, so we have that. Let's take a look at what it looks like in the render view. So I'm going to turn off preview and hit render. And there we go. We're getting a render just like that. You can see the light refracting through the rain particles. You can see the splashes down here. As you can see, they're very exaggerated. I pushed them up rather high. That's one thing you'll find. If they look a little exaggerated in the viewport, they're going to be very exaggerated due to motion blur in the final render. But nevertheless, rather cool looking, I must say. So, there we go. We have our rain right out of the box. However, we can do more with this. And for example, what if, say, I want to be getting a wet look from wherever the rain is hitting the ground, or ripples in standing water on the ground? I can achieve all those effects using one other thing that is included in the asset. So if I go back to our scene view, I'm going to turn off real quick our auto update so that doesn't try to keep updating while we're working. Go back into the scene view and I dive inside. So let me unlock our rain asset. I dive inside the rain asset into the included shopnet, and you can see we have a raindrop shader, and that's what we're using to give the raindrops their transparent look. It's based on the glass shader that comes with Houdini, but we also have a wet shader. Now I'm going to copy that out of here and create a shopnet here at the top of the scene just to make things a little bit more convenient, and I'll paste it in there. There we go, wet shader. And as you can see, our wet shader is basically a standard Houdini material shader, except for the inclusion of this wet tab. Now, the wet tab allows you to use a wet map to define wet areas on your texture, and then use that to adjust the surface's specularity and diffuse darkness, because usually as things get wet, they get darker and shinier. However, we can also use the rain to create a dynamic wet map. So that's pretty cool. So as the rain hits the surface, it will paint wetness onto any object that we apply this shader to. And also down here we have a ripples function. So using our rain, we can generate ripples around wherever the rain is impacting the surface, and wherever we define the water on the surface to be deep enough to actually ripple. For example, some objects like stone, you wouldn't want to have ripples happening on that, but if you have puddles on a cobblestone street, you would want some ripples. So you get the idea. However, to do this, we need a point cloud from our from our rain, and this point cloud is going to represent where the rain has collided with objects. So, fortunately, on our rain asset, we have a point cloud exporter under the wet map tab. So if I go in here, we have the basic geometry render settings. I have a predefined path which matches the path used in our shader. And if I hit render, we will have something to work with. I'm going to just render out this frame, just for convenience's sake, and since we aren't doing an animation. So current frame, and let's render that out. And as is normal for point clouds, render out very quickly. And we now have a point cloud for this shader to use. So let's apply this shader to our ground. So let's go into materials, go into our ShopNet, wet shader right there, apply that, and there's one more thing we need to do. This is a UV based effect. It uses UVs for wet maps and puddle maps for defining where your water is. So let's throw down a UV texture node, and we'll just use the basic orthographic projection since this is a flat surface. It should work fine. There we go. And we can see already that the shader includes a mandrel picture as a puddle map, just to help us see the effect. So there it is under the puddle mask. We have our mandrel picture. Kind of silly, but it works. We don't have any wet map happening. That must be, oh, our diffuse is also the mandrel. So just something to see how things work real quick. Alright, so let's see what happens now that we have our wet shader applied to the ground and that we have rendered out our point cloud. And I'm going to turn off the rain so we can see what's happening a little easier. And let's go to our render view. Let that render. It's going pretty quickly. And you know what? I think I will just skip ahead to when this is all rendered out and we'll see the completed image. So be back in 1 second. Alright, we are back, and as you can see we have ripples and wet shiny textures, and we can still see our original diffuse texture, but it's been darkened. And if we scroll up close, we can see that yes indeed we have some circular impact ripples happening wherever the water is deep enough and wherever we're getting hits from the rain. We also have some noise ripples going in there too to add a little extra detail. And you can see these ripples are all being confined to certain areas. Since we're using the mandrel image not only as our diffuse layer, but also as our puddle map to define how deep the water is, you can kind of compare here, and you can see the lighter areas tend to have deeper water, and the darker areas tend to be pretty shallow. And that's because as the values in the puddle map approach 1, that is considered the deepest water, and as the values approach 0, that is no water. So using those values you can control where these ripples are going to happen. Also, over here towards the edge, you can see the area that was not made wet. Since our rain was falling from directly above and being pushed to the side by wind, we actually have a little area that was never touched by the rain, so you can see this line where the dynamic wet map ends. So yeah, there we go, pretty cool. I also took some time to render it out with rain, so you can kind of see how the two effects combine. We have a pretty chaotic scene here with our exaggerated splashes going on, but in a real render I'd probably turn down the size of the splashes so that it's a bit more subtle. However, overall I'd say pretty cool scene. We have some good looking rain right off the bat with basically no fiddling with the controls. So this is great, this is awesome. However, what if we want to have a slightly different look? What are those controls and how can we use them to create new rain looks or to refine the one that we have created from a preset? So let's go back to our main scene, and I will do a quick walkthrough of some of the controls we have available here and what they can do to change your scene. So we've already talked about the input geo briefly, how you can have multiple emitters and colliders. Also, underneath these, you can see we have extra controls. So for the emitter, we can control how the particles are emitted. Right now they're being scattered onto the surface, but you can do all the normal particle emission things like emitting from points, or scattering onto all geometry that's passed in. We can also use an attribute to refine how much rain is emitted from which parts of the geometry. And let's set that up real quick. So I'm going to go into our emitter and I'm going to throw down a wrangle node. Let's just do a normal attribute wrangle. Plug that in, turn it on. I'm going to create a new attribute called emit, just for simplicity's sake. You can, of course, name it whatever you want. Here's the syntax for doing it if you've never used wrangles before. So we're creating emit, setting it to 0, and we're also going to throw down a paint node. Plug that in, turn on our paint node, and I'm going to override our paint color with our emit attribute. So let's turn off the visibility of the rest of the scene so we can just focus on painting. And hitting enter, believe, enter, yes. And I'll go into grayscale, prefer you working into that. We'll change our brush size up to 1. And our opacity maybe 2, or that's UV radius, sorry. Opacity to 0.25, we'll say. And just start painting in our emit values. There we go, and then just increase them a lot right there. Maybe I'll decrease our edge values a bit by holding down the middle mouse button. That is subtracting from the values, while left click is adding values. So there we go, and let's terminate our string of nodes with a null for organization. Name it out, and there we go. We have our emit values. And to use those, we just go in here, input, emitters, show emission settings, and then down here we type in emit. And of course we need to reset the simulation. Let's go back to the first frame and hit reset sim, and already you can see our rain is being restricted to those values greater than 0. So there we go. If we let it run, we have a much more organic shape of rain coming out now, rather than that big square of rain that was falling down earlier. And so you can see you can restrict your rain to certain areas of your scene, or even better yet, say you want to have the rain more dense near your camera and then less dense as it goes into the background to save on geometry and render time. The way you would do that is just paint higher values closer to the camera and then fade them out to black as you go away from the camera. So very useful if you are trying to get a certain look or cut down on render times, because Rendering rain can sometimes get a little intensive with the refractions and all the geometry going on. Alright, so we have that underneath our emitters. I'm going to close that for now. Down here under colliders and ground, we have the same controls basically, and that is our collision volume controls. So whether we want to create a volume by using a ray intersect and a resolution to create them, or you can actually define your own collision volumes using VDBs or the ISO offset node and use the volume sample to use those instead of normal geometry. Same thing down here, although I've had some mixed results with using volume sample for the ground object. You can try it, but I actually tend to like plugging predefined volumes into colliders rather than grounds. Just a personal preference. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the input geo tab. Let's go to the sim tab. Up here we have the standard simulation settings that you see on every DOP node, such as the reset, how many sub-steps we're using, what the start frame is, which is useful for pre-rolling. Also up here we have a visualize sim button, which turns on the particle view. Here we can see our rain. Pink is the particle trail for the raindrops. Down here, kind of hard to see, let me turn off the ground. Down here we also have some other colors going on. Red, you can probably see, is the splash that is happening from the impacts. And green is something else. Green is the point cloud that is being created of all the impact locations. So that's what we rendered out and used in our texture earlier. So let's turn that back off for now. Highlight that so we can easily see our rain. Alright, down here we have our drop count. That is how many raindrops are spawned each second, I think. And this is scaled by the area of your emitter too, so it'll always kind of maintain a constant density no matter how big your emitter is. You can give it an initial velocity. You can see here for the heavy falling rain effect, I've given it a -10 to get it off to a fast start, so it feels like it's falling hard and fast. Variance is for varying from the base velocity. Gravity is pretty obvious. Global drag is how much our air is going to slow down the particle's descent. Messed up something there. Alright, and down here we have bounds. This is useful for making sure you don't have particles falling for forever or limiting your particles to a specific portion of your scene. So if I turn off the show guide, you can see that our large box here is the bounding box and we're using it. And whenever particles go outside it, they are automatically deleted, or if the emitter is outside the box, they will never be simulated, so that speeds up our sim times. Wind, pretty obvious. We have the direction and intensity of the wind, so it's blowing from this side. We have the wind drag, how much the wind affects our particles, and we have a noise, a wind noise, so that creates a bit of randomness in the effect. Now trails. The raindrops are actually single points that fall from the emitter. The trails option creates these nice long raindrop trails behind them, kind of gives it a more natural look. If you didn't need those, say you were making a snow simulation, or maybe you had geometry that you wanted to instance onto the raindrop points instead of generating it per each raindrop, which can help speed up time, especially for background rain. You could turn off trails and save that simulation time. Also the same for splashes. You can do the same there. You can turn those off. Splash We have a couple different controls here which are useful. We have the birth probability of the splash, so that cuts down how likely a splash is to occur for each impact. I'm having it at 0.5 just to kind of keep things a little bit more subdued. Drop counts, how many drops are generated at during each splash. The splash life controls how long it lasts. Life variance varies that. Spread amount is the angle at which the angle that the particles spread from the impact vector, or actually the reflection of the impact vector. So if your rain hits a surface, the reflection rate is calculated, and then the variance is how much the drops spread out from that. So splash energy, how much of the raindrop's speed is used to determine the speed of the splash and how far it goes and such. And then randomizing just kind of randomizes its effect for more natural luck. Okay, down here at the bottom we have the point cloud, and that was the green particles we saw earlier. Excuse me. That we are using in our material node for to calculate wetness and ripples. And those represent where raindrops have impacted the ground at some point in time. As you can see, the point life on these are very long. That way I can use them constantly to create the wet map. However, say if you wanted the ground to slowly dry out, you could lower that life and have it so the wet map slowly evaporates. It could create some pretty cool effects. Over here in the cache sim, this is mainly just for convenience, so you don't have to sim out the whole thing every time you load up your file. You can write out your simulation to this path, or you can of course set your own path, and you can load in from disk your simulation rather than loading it from the DOPS network inside of the asset. Over here we have the rain geo. This all happens after the simulation is complete. This is how our raindrops are meshed. If we zoom up, we can see they are actually tubes that have been swept along the trail of the raindrop, and we can do a lot of things to affect them. For example, we talked about our raindrop size earlier. We can change that, create fat raindrops, and that wasn't a very obvious one, I'm afraid. Not sure what's going on there. Well, my bad. Alright, I'll have to look into what's going on there in a moment. However, we also have another method of creating trails. So obviously generating trails from as a particle has the side effect of a heavier sim, slower time, such things like that. So we can get around that by using a quick trail, and this is basically looking up what the main raindrop particle's position was so many frames back. So I could change that to 1 frame back or 3 frames back to get different effects. Now the one downside of this is if there's a lot of wind going on in your simulation, it can create a less realistic effect. So it may become obvious that you aren't really using a real simulated trail. Often though, I would say you're pretty safe. So I'm going to turn that off for now since we have simulated the particle trails. Trail resolution is how many times the trail is subdivided to smooth things out. The sweep divisions is for the tube that is swept along the trail, and you can change that to increased accuracy or decrease memory footprint. And down here we have the trail shape, which can affect how the raindrops look. So for example, if I wanted a sharper point on the head of the raindrop, you can get some looks from that. This is obviously going to be affected also by your trail resolution. So let's pop that up to 4, say. So we have 4 points in each range drop trail. So yeah, you can get some different looks out of that. I personally prefer the resolution of 2 and the flat-headed rain particle shape. Down here we have the splash controls. We can fade out the splash size over time so that it eventually fades completely away as it ages. So you can see I just got rid of that, and the particles are much larger now. I can lower this end, and I believe that is the death position, so that's actually how they're supposed to be working. So they fade out over time. Culling is kind of like a bounding box. However, it applies to what particles are swept into, have geometry swept along them. So if I turn it on, cull particles, you can see that we're only keeping the ones in our culling box. This is very useful if you, say, have a close-up shot and you don't want to have to worry about all the other geometry in the scene. But at the same time, you have a couple wide shots later on that would benefit from the full simulation. So just another way to save yourself some memory and some time. And finally, we of course have the material, which I showed you earlier, which is inside of the asset in the shop net. And on the last tab we have the wet map, which we used to render out our point clouds earlier. We also have a drop wetness parameter, which can set how wet each impact is and create kind of a build-up effect of wetness as more and more particles hit an area. So it kind of feels like the material is slowly getting wetter and wetter rather than instantly wet, maximum wet, whenever a single particle hits it. It's something that can help you depending on the effect you're going for. And that is pretty much it. Just as an example of what we can do, let's just tweak something real quick. I'm going to drop this down to say -2, leave the gravity the same, I'll leave the bounding box on. Let's turn off wind. I'm going to turn down the amplitude of the noise to say about 2 as well. We'll leave use trail on, we'll leave splash on. However, I will turn down the energy to, let's say, 0.5. And you can see already we have, no, never mind, that was just me clicking away. And finally, point cloud we can leave the same. Let's hit reset simulation and play forward. And now we have a lighter looking effect. I think these trails still look a little long to me. So let's turn down how long our trails last. Let's turn that down to about 0.25. One thing to note is trail length does affect your substeps. So a value here of 0.25 means that we are required to do 4 substeps a frame. So it will slow down your simulation if you have shorter trails like this, but it shouldn't be too terribly noticeable. As you can see, it's running pretty fast. These are really short trails, and I don't think I really like them that short. Let's jump back up to about 0.5. There we go. And there we have a look that's a little more interesting and a little less intense than our heavy rain. So, and then if we wanted, we could go in and change the look of our individual raindrops. Let's play through a little further, see how our impacts look. Those are much too large. I will go over into our rain geo tab, go down to the splash size, and I will drop that back down to 0.5 probably. feels much more fitting. So if we play that, you can see we're getting a much more subdued effect. And if I were to render out the point cloud, I could use this in my material and tweak that material further to get an even more exact look. So you can see not only can we set up very fast rain effects that we can use in a scene, but we can also go into a lot more detail and get the exact look we're going for. We can even output these points and use them as points to instance geometry onto, such as snowflakes or ash particles. You get the idea. So, anyways, that pretty much wraps it up. This has been Nathan showing you the Rain 2.0 tool. I hope you enjoy it, and stay tuned for more interesting, useful